As part of HARDtalk's democracy season, I've come to rural Sussex. This is the home of one of Britain's longest-serving politicians. He began his political career under Churchill. He's still going strong under Gordon Brown. He has seen momentous political change. But just how healthy is Britain's democracy today? Lord Healey, welcome to HARDtalk.
Thank you.
Going back to the very beginning of your political career, you always have put a focus on the pursuit of equality. Are you disappointed, looking back on your 50-odd years of political life, that democracy in the UK hasn't delivered equality?
Well, what I was always keen on was equality of opportunity, and I think that has been delivered to a degree which was inconceivable after the war.
I was interested when you published your memoirs that at the very beginning of them you wrote, "I am a socialist who believes the Labour Party offers the best hope for Britain's future. My faith in the moral values which socialism represents remains undiminished." Now, admittedly, you wrote that some years ago. Does it apply today?
I think so, yes.
Why is it then that your party, which has been very successful at the ballot box, no longer uses the word socialism?
I don't know why, and I don't think it matters a damn whether they do or not. But I think the real thing is that socialism was defined when the Labour Party committed itself to socialism as the public ownership of means of production and distribution. And I don't think that is necessary or necessarily a good thing. I think it was a good thing to improve the situation as we have improved it, but I don't think total equality in that sense is necessary.
See, I'm just wondering, in September of 1973, when you were actually Shadow Chancellor, you said, quote, and this is about Labour's tax plan, "I warn you, there are going to be howls of anguish from those rich enough to pay over 75% on the top slice of their earnings."
And there was.
I'm sure there was.
Yeah.
But I just wonder why now, with a Labour government in power, you believe that there is no talk of increasing the top rate of taxation on those earning the most money beyond 40%.
Because all they do is they move their money abroad, which is bad for us because we lose income from it.
But that's surely not true. If one were to, for example, as the Liberal Democrats have toyed with, if one were to raise the top rate of tax to 50% over, say, £100,000, there's hardly going to be a mass exodus from the country, but it would be a significant signal of an intent toward redistribution.
I think there would be a substantial flight of capital abroad, and that has happened already, of course.
Does
but
that
it
mean,
would increase.
Does that mean redistribution in Britain's 21st century democracy is impossible?
Well, we do have an enormous amount of redistribution now because of the differences in tax rates at different incomes.
Let me quote to you Polly Twinbee, who, having heard Alistair Darling's pre-budget report, she wrote a searing column in which she said that...
I read it.
You did? She essentially accused Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, of cowardice, of leaving social democracy for dead.
Well, I think that's nonsense.
Why? Why do you dismiss her case?
Because they have done an enormous amount to improve equality of opportunity already, and they're continuing to do that. Not as much as Polly would like, but there you are. She's a journalist, and journalists, of course, often are unrealistic in their understanding of things.
But take...
might even apply to you.
It might well, but
Yeah.
but take inheritance tax,
Yeah.
which
I think it's fair to say, probably I'll ask you, when you were Chancellor, did you regard inheritance tax as actually an important way of levelling the playing field,
Yes,
of achieving this equality that we've talked about?
It was one way of doing it, and I did increase it for that reason.
But I wonder if it gave you pause when you heard Alistair Darling in the Commons saying that he was essentially going to ape what the Tories were saying and doing, and he was going to cut inheritance tax for those who, let's face it, are the wealthier in the United Kingdom.
I think he's a very able man, and of course the Prime Minister Gordon, I think, is one of the ablest people we've ever had in that job. So if they support it, I would tend to support them.
I mean, I don't want to just quote Polly Toynbee at you, but these are her words. What we had, she said, is a £1.4 billion inheritance bonus for children of the well-off, slashing of capital gains tax on second homes and shares, while the children of the poor get an extra 48p a week in tax credits.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with her on that.
Gordon Brown has made a mistake, do you think?
I think so. You know, journalists never make mistakes, as we all know, because they write what is thought about them. But politicians often make mistakes, and I think probably overdid it there.
Do you think, in the end, that the Labour Party today has as great a commitment to the equality message that you had when you were at the top of the Labour Party tree?
No, I don't think they have a greater one, but I have the same one.
Do you think so?
Yes.
Does the British public really place equality of opportunity as its number one priority?
I think they wouldn't now put it that way because they're rather satisfied with the situation as it is. But if we reduced it, I think there would be, and rightly, tremendous opposition in the country.
We've talked a lot about Gordon Brown already. We haven't mentioned Tony Blair. Do you believe Tony Blair, talking first about domestic policy, was a true inheritor of the Labour Party tradition?
Not quite, and I don't think he would claim that because he was not in any sense old Labour. He was what was called New Labour, which is quite a different thing. But then it's a new country. As I say, when I started, class divisions were very, very deep. Working class people wore cloth caps, middle class people wore trilbies or bowlers, and the toffs wore top hats. Now that world has completely disappeared. And so politics has to adjust to reality like that.
He's been described in one recent book as Thatcher's son. The ideological sort of strand running from Thatcher through Major, arguably, but certainly to Blair. Do you see that? Blair
no,
has
I
been
don't think he's Thatcher's son, but of course he had to face the situation bequeathed to him by Thatcher. I mean, I think Tony did quite well in his first few years, but he stayed on far too long and made terrible errors in his last few years, including the Iraq, supporting the Americans in Iraq, university entrance fees, foundation hospitals, and above all, cash for peerages. And so it was a very good thing that in the end he handed over to Gordon Brown, although he'd promised at the Granita meeting they had to do so much earlier.
I think people, having seen the pre-budget report, are now asking themselves, well, how is Gordon Brown, whom I think you're suggesting is more old Labour, more mainstream Labour than Blair ever was.
Yes, I think so.
How is Brown going to show that? How is it going to manifest itself? He has cut inheritance tax. He has slashed capital gains for second home owners, for people who hold shares. Those do not appear to be moves of a man who is trying to reposition his government to be more left of centre.
No, but I think right and left of centre have much less meaning than they used to have in the old days. What you've got to look at now is how you're going to get an efficient economy producing more wealth for the country, and then your job as a Chancellor or Prime Minister is to see that the tax system ensures that the poor gain more than the rich.
Sounds as though in your political lifetime you've seen the job of government become much more managerial, much less ideological.
I think that's true.
Is that healthy?
I think so. I think ideology, if you take the word seriously, which means a fixed way of looking at everything, is finished. Very dangerous indeed, ideology. What we need now is pragmatic governments with a sense of vision and a belief in the brotherhood of man. And that I think we have.
If one is looking for ideology today, and it is sometimes quite hard when one's comparing Labour and Conservative to see much of an ideological difference, maybe the difference lies in some of the things that David Cameron is saying right now, because in its broadest brush, he seems to be saying the era of top-down government, as he puts it, is over, and the time has come for the politicians to a certain extent to let go, to trust the people more and see much more of a bottom-up philosophy. Do you buy that?
Well, I think expressions like that are what the French call mer de boeuf, bullshit. And I'd just like to see what in fact he's going to propose and judge him on what he proposes and not on this nonsense, which in fact is ideological.
Do you think it is?
Yeah.
Because he talks about choice and responsibility. He talks about communities and individuals making many more decisions for themselves.
Well,
if
that
it
is
comes
an
to education,
ideological difference from Labour.
What you're suggesting,
I wouldn't say
Labour
it is
doesn't
more than
believe in...
Labour. I think, frankly, one of the problems with Cameron is he's moving closer and closer to the Labour Party, and as you know, is creating more and more opposition to him from the old type Tories in his own party.
True, but if you're suggesting to me that those words, choice, responsibility, define him against Labour, that's dangerous for Labour, isn't it? I mean, nobody can argue that...
No, but I don't think people would believe that Labour is against choice rather than responsibility.
We've talked a lot about the health of Britain's democracy, but when you set out on your political life, turnout in elections was enormous.
Yeah.
Elections now, it's regarded as very positive if they get to 65 or 70%.
I think that the low vote is a proof that the democracy has produced a situation people like.
Well, if I may say so, that is the view of a very optimistic man, because there's another view, which is the low turnout reflects deep cynicism and disaffection with our political process.
I don't think that's true at all. Where's the evidence of that?
If you look at the polls, people say that the profession they have least admiration for is that of politics.
That's true, and that may be one reason why they don't bother to vote. But I mean, the fact is that politicians have produced a situation in which the class system has disappeared, everybody is well off and getting better off all the time.
If we lift our eyes to a sort of even wider horizon, just thinking about democracy and the wider world, Tony Blair, George Bush, over the last decade, have, in a sense, created the idea there is a moral imperative to championing democracy, indeed intervening on behalf of democracy in the wider world. You spend a lot of your career on defence matters, foreign policy matters. Do you believe that?
I think it's yes, but again, the question is whether you understand the situation in another country in order so that you can intervene in a sensible way. And very often countries don't. I think on the whole we've done quite well in Iraq, although it is still a very, very dangerous country, and I think the intervention there was a great mistake to put the military there, because it turned the whole of the Islamic world against the West. I think in Africa it's very, very difficult to get tribal societies like that to adopt democracy as we understand it. And it hasn't happened very well in many places. Some places disaster like Zimbabwe.
And yet, Tony Blair, 10 years after Rwanda, for example, he said, if today we were presented with a situation in a country like Rwanda where 1 million people face slaughter, there would be a moral duty to intervene.
I agree entirely about that, and I supported his policy on those issues very much. But you have to look very carefully at country by country and decide whether intervention will be a good or a bad thing, and sometimes it turns out to be a very bad thing.
Do you think post-Iraq it is going to be very difficult for a democracy such as ours to engage in that sort of interventionism again?
Well, if you take the case of Iran, I think it's very difficult indeed, because the question is whether you've got enough local people who are likely to get power who share your views. And I don't think we can be certain of that at all in Iran.
When I began, I posited a sort of moralism about the message that George Bush and Tony Blair gave us over Iraq. You, looking at your career, never really engaged in that sort of moral analysis of international problems.
Well, I learned very fast when I was Defence Secretary and had to deal with the problems east of Suez, that the extent to which external powers can impose their own views on countries in Africa and Asia is very limited indeed. And especially if they use bombs to get rid of the baddies. I mean, I've always been able to contrast Britain's achievement in Borneo, where I wouldn't allow the Air Force to drop a single bomb, and we won with fewer casualties on the roads in a bank holiday weekend in Britain, with the American one in Vietnam, where they dropped millions of bombs, killed millions of people, and lost.
I suppose I was also thinking about your stance toward communism. You were there at the height of the Cold War.
Yes.
You, if one reads the record, you at times, when Khrushchev was in power in Moscow, for example, you clearly felt that there was the potential to reach out to this Russian leader and to do a deal.
Yes, and we had some success there. And I think our policy towards Khrushchev helped to produce Gorbachev, who did in fact produce a complete secular change.
Do you? Because you see, the way many commentators interpret the history of the last 50 years now is that it was the strength, the hawkishness of Reagan and Thatcher, which ultimately brought the communist totalitarian regime crashing down, and that your approach simply delayed that collapse.
Well, I think that is Maire de Boeuf again.
Well, it's a proposition that appears on the face of it to have evidence on its side.
How? Why do you say that?
Surely the Soviet Union in the end collapsed because Reagan and Thatcher, but Reagan in particular, took the decision to ramp up defense budgets, to take on the Star Wars project, which appeared to threaten the Soviets' deterrent. The Soviets felt they had to spend to keep up, and they could not.
I think that was one of the major factors, but it was by no means the only one. And I think the fact that many of the Soviet politicians at the time understood Britain's approach was one of the factors which made the success of getting rid of old-style communism possible.
Well, you see, I come back to the moral element in politics. I suppose you must at the time have considered that when you were reaching out to Khrushchev, when you really believed that a deal might be done with the Soviets, if you found that deal and the disengagement that you sought, you would have left tens, hundreds of millions of people still living under a totalitarian regime.
No, because I think if we'd got that, you'd have had great changes taking place in the Soviet Union as well.
But what if you hadn't? My point is simply that...
Well, if it hadn't, it would have been bad. But I'm just telling you what I believed.
So the idea that in the end there could be no compromise with communism, an idea that I suppose we now associate with Reagan and Thatcher, that was simply facile, was it?
It wasn't true. You could, and we did, and in the end it succeeded. But it was a slow business, of course.
Do you think then, when one looks today at the problems the world has, and clearly right now, Islamist terror, Islamist extremism is regarded as an international problem?
Well, that was produced by Bush, who talked about a crusade against Islamism. And that, of course, produced a jihad against the West. It was a total disaster. Bush became the great Satan of the Muslim world. I mean, that was an absolute disaster.
Do you really believe it began with opposition to Bush's policies? Surely the roots of Islamism, Islamic extremism, go much deeper and further back into history
than that. But the fact is that Western policy could help or hinder.
I just wonder whether you feel democracies, the UK, the United States, Western democracies, have a coherent strategy now for countering this Islamist threat as identified by Bush and many others.
No, I don't think we have. As I say, I think that Bush's promise of a crusade against Islamism produced the jihad against the West.
So if direct interventionism is a disaster, what is the right approach?
It's really talking to people and trying to get them to change their mind, and that, thank God, is what we're last going to try with the Iranians.
But you wouldn't talk to Osama bin Laden, would you? Or would you?
No, because I don't think you can affect, but he's not a government, he's an important force in the world. But again, you've got to try to find terrorists you can talk to.
Lord Healey, thank you very much for being on HARDtalk.
It's a pleasure, young man.
Thank you.